One thing I want to ask you guys about is your opinion on the ICJ, because there have been a lot of debate about this. Obviously, having Israel being held accountable for their crimes is fantastic. There's concerns about what the ICJ can actually do to prevent genocide. I recently covered a case which I think is important, where you have Nicaragua charging Germany for assisting the genocide in Israel, in Palestine, I should say. They are the largest arms provider next to the United States, providing around 47% of the weapons to Gaza. The reason why this case is important because this case actually asks questions about international law. What does it actually mean to prevent genocide? What does it actually mean to maintain international law? So, in a very vague way, I'm gonna go with Reem first. I'm gonna go in the opposite order I did last time. I'm gonna ask you very broadly what are the guys' thoughts, like how optimistic you guys are about the ICJ. Because I've seen a lot of varying opinions. I've seen a lot of people say, "Oh, this is the greatest thing ever," and then some people are like, "Oh, it doesn't mean anything." I'm just interested in hearing what your guys' opinion on this. I'll start with Reem. We go around the panel.
I don't believe in what the ICJ is doing. I mean, no, I don't. I'm not convinced. I think it's a. I posted about this. I think it's a trial to ease white people's conscience. Um,
Interesting. Interesting.
Bluntly, because we don't have time to ask these questions right now. Um, these questions should have been asked over the past 75 years. They should have been asked during the Bosnian genocide. They should have been asked before that.
Absolutely.
Oh, so we don't have time to sit around and discuss and experiment and provide theories when we know that a people have a right to resist when they are faced with occupation, colonization, and the level of violence that we're seeing. I'm just going to give you a little bit about my background because I think this is important to.
Go ahead.
I used to be a journalist, and so it was my job to analyze the language used in different spaces in the media, in different circles. I worked in the development sector. I worked with nonprofits, and in the U.S., I've worked in media both in the U.S. and in the Middle East. So a lot of the language that is being used is, again, it's being used to not only chip away, but to put people asleep and to forget that we have a right to resist, that we have a right to defend ourselves. And that's what's been happening with the ICJ. I think it was just something to buy time. Um, it didn't stop the Israelis from continuing the genocide. We're at what, 40,000 plus? And that's not even the number it's not even an accurate number. It's more than that. And we're hearing that from folks on the ground, the kind of things that we're seeing. You can't imagine the level of violence. So I don't think the ICJ is legitimate at this point, to be honest. I think it's they noticed that things were getting out of hand, uh, that more and more people were like you said earlier in the introduction, that Israel is losing the world. They're losing the narrative. They're losing um, credibility. And then they were like, okay, let's do something to they still recognize Israel as a state. That in itself should show you that there's something wrong. This court is not for us. It's not going to do anything for us, for our people. Um, yeah, I think it's a joke,
Yeah,
to be
that's a
honest.
very interesting perspective, and this is kind of what I said in the beginning as well. And I had people like, "Oh, Nick, come on, man, you've been too negative." And once again, I will listen to the Palestinians. I'm not making this shit up. I will listen to the Palestinians on the ground. They was like, "Oh, we're fucked." I'm like, because they're not going to save us. The ICJ is not going to prevent the 40,000 plus, which I think that number is still bullshit. 40,000 plus Palestinians being killed. They're not going to stop it because the UN Security Council will have to approve action, and the United States will veto that. So I'm like, even if the ICJ rule against Israel in the most strongest way possible, the United States will veto any action that need to be taken at the UN Security Council. I explained that in the hotspot video I made at the very beginning of it, and I got feedback. I listened to the feedback. I'm very attentive to, I think, good faith feedback. There were a lot of people that was like, "Oh man, I just think you're good. You're being super negative. Nick, and I'm like, oh, okay, I hear you guys. I can see why this is a good thing, but that's why I think your perspective is very interesting. I would love to hear from more of the panel. We can practice save, and then we can do the go bus run next. I'm sorry if I'm saying your guys' names. I don't feel bad about that. Let's go save next.
That's okay. Yeah, I mean, I'll just keep it brief. I I want to condition this by saying all international law courts are inherently colonial. Whether it's the ICJ, whether it's the ICC, they are all cut from the same cloth that the imperialists designed in their world order. However, I don't think that the ICJ is going to stop the genocide. I think for that it is a completely useless tool. But as a Marxist-Leninist, I do advocate utilizing a variety of tactics. And I think that the ICJ case is important symbolically in a broader dialectical way, in that it is pointing towards what is probably the number one ally of the United States. The 51st state, if we're being honest here. It is a proxy for American interests being held to the standards of the international law that Washington supposedly promulgates throughout the world. I think it is in the context of specific to Israel and Palestine, it is a smaller symbolic stage in the much broader moment that is starting to delegitimize Israel in the eyes of the world. Is it going to stop anything in the long run? No, but the resistance factions did say that they welcomed the ICJ case. Again, there were a lot of very cringe kind of images circulating online of like a very paternalistic like man in a South African cape being draped in a South African cape helping out like a Palestinian guy on the ground. It was clearly made by AI, but I think that's the wrong attitude.
I can see why that annoys you guys. I can see why that can be annoying. But go ahead.
Yeah, no, that was weird. But I think it's symbolically it has its place, but I don't think that it should be held up as this monumental achievement when it's not, if that makes any sense. Like the colonial institutions are never going to stop colonialism itself, but for Israel, which is in many ways an anachronistic colony that is still existing in the 21st century today, to actually be held to some kind of standards by these colonial institutions does speak volumes to just how nakedly brutal it is. Again, I don't want to say that it's important because it's not, but I do think it has a place in the history of the broader struggle, even if it ends up not.
Yeah, I in what you said earlier about these are being colonial institutions is 100% on point. But I think it's a very interesting trend with where you have South Africa and Nicaragua, because these are countries who are victims of colonialism. And it's almost like they know, but they got to prove it. You know what I mean? So these countries who are victims of colonialism is trying to expose international law. And they're like, is this shit real or not? Which we all know is not real, but there are a lot of people who are institutionalists that may have to see these cases to acknowledge that. I think there are a lot of people who are realizing that this facade of the rules-based order is exactly that, a facade. Bushra, I would love to hear from you, and then we have a few more things we're going to touch up on as well. But go ahead. Your general thought about the ICJ or your reaction to anything anyone said?
Yeah, I mean, no prisoners came out. Not a single centimeter of land was liberated. No refugee was able to return permanently to their home. So to me, looking at the material reality, nothing was accomplished for our people. I do think it could be a form of agitation, as Saif Sheikh Jarrah was mentioning. But beyond that, also understanding and not reducing the complications of the comprador involved in a lot of the theater that was promoted online, in that the Palestinian Authority really invested in the media of that case. And in that same spirit, it's also important that we examine who from South Africa was presenting and ask ourselves, is South Africa really liberated right now? And did their participation in anti-apartheid negotiation with their prison guards as Mandela did, and the funding they accepted from people like George Soros to build up housing, to sink a majority of indigenous South Africans into severe poverty. True down South Africans warn us not to go down that path. And I hear them, and they supported our resistance. But it was the ones who supported our resistance who got squashed by that bought out comprador. And in that same spirit, when we look at these cases, looking at the Palestinian Authority and what they have at stake here is very important, especially because we came to find that the Palestinian Authority was actively trying to destroy Hamas in Gaza just to be able to take over it themselves and continue to serve their masters. So what really was going on here is a question for all of us to ask ourselves as to, if this was to be of benefit to anybody, was there the potential for our most vulnerable to be exploited? We like to celebrate these things because they look good, but in the end, it's our most vulnerable who end up paying the most severe price. And we got to remember to always center our refugees who are along the borders and within Palestine itself wanting to go home, and the thousands of prisoners who are being held hostage right now within the colonial prisons who need to be liberated. When they are not mentioned, then what is this really serving?
Those are fantastic points. Like it's always great to be in conversations with people who can bring perspectives that I haven't really considered before. Because usually I gotta drag motherfuckers to my position. So I am at home on this panel. And speaking of, I'm very interested in hearing you guys' thoughts on this. I'm gonna show you guys a few things first, and I'm gonna give you guys thoughts on this, because the narrative that's coming from the liberals and professional managerial class who are trying to convince themselves that the Democratic Party is worth a damn is that Biden is a victim of Benjamin Netanyahu extremism. That Biden want to rein in. I know you guys heard this. Biden want to rein in Netanyahu, but there's nothing he can do. We know why that's bullshit. I said it before, and when I pass you guys can give your overall thoughts. I said it before. I think Biden cutting aid to UNRWA during this famine is probably the most evil thing a politician did in my lifetime. Like, what's worse than that? And then you have this as well. The United States has seen no evidence that Israel committed a genocide. Now, I almost don't even want to insult your guys' intelligence by even having you to rebuke that.